The street watcher. Sarah Miller had never imagined that this would be her life. At 17, she had everything most people could ever want: comfortable living in a sprawling Connecticut home, a future paved by private school education, and parents who seemed to have it all together. But the world she knew crumbled one fateful day when her father's investment firm collapsed, taking their life savings with it. The shock waves spread, destroying not only their financial future, but the very foundation of their family. Her mother, unable to handle the shame, walked away from their life without a word, leaving Sarah and her father to pick up the pieces. But her father's heart couldn't take the weight of his failures. One cold winter night, he made a permanent decision that would forever change Sarah's world. His body was found beneath a bridge, leaving Sarah to face a harsh new reality alone. With no relatives willing to take her in, Sarah found herself abandoned on the unforgiving streets of New York City. She became one of the countless invisible faces that blurred into the city's busy backdrop. But Sarah was no ordinary street kid. She had learned to observe, closely, sharply. Her survival depended on it. She studied people, their habits, their routines. She watched how they moved, what they ignored, and most importantly, how they treated the people who had no place to go. The city was a jungle, and Sarah had learned to be its quiet observer. Near the prestigious Carlton Cafe on Fifth Avenue, Sarah found her corner. She had watched this spot for months. Each day at 12:30 sharp, Richard Thompson, the CEO of Thompson Industries, would step out of his towering office building, walk precisely 73 steps, and enter the cafe. He would sit at the same window table, order his usual chicken salad on rye and black coffee, and read his newspaper. There was nothing remarkable about his routine, except that Richard Thompson was different from most of the wealthy businessmen Sarah had observed. Richard never ignored her. While others would pass by without even a glance, Richard would offer a soft nod or occasionally drop a bill into her cup. There was a kindness in him that reminded Sarah of her father before everything had fallen apart. It was a quiet compassion that made her wonder what kind of man he truly was. Her father had been consumed by pride and ambition, but Richard seemed to balance both with genuine care. Sometimes, when the winter was brutal, Richard would stop by and ask if she needed medical attention. He didn't look at her like she was invisible, like so many others did. Sarah had come to look forward to his brief appearances, watching him from her corner as he went about his day, completely unaware that his every action was being closely scrutinized. But there was something Sarah noticed about Richard's life that began to disturb her. His wife, Victoria Thompson, appeared at the cafe every so often, always impeccably dressed in designer clothes, her icy demeanor contrasting sharply with Richard's warm presence. Victoria's eyes never held the same kindness that Richard's did. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with her. It wasn't just the way she dressed or the way she looked down on the people around her. It was in the way she acted when Richard spoke about his charitable work or his latest business deals. Victoria's eyes would roll, and her fingers would drum impatiently on the table, as if her husband's kindness to others bored her. Sarah had started to pay close attention to the dynamics between the couple. She noticed that, more often than not, Richard's business partner, a well-groomed young man named Marcus Reed, seemed to be part of these lunch meetings when Richard was away. Marcus and Victoria would meet in private, always sitting at the back table, and always leaving separately, as if they were hiding something. Sarah had begun to feel like she was witnessing a drama unfolding, one that she couldn't fully comprehend yet. But today, something was different. Sarah had arrived at her usual spot early that morning, hoping for a bit of luck with the morning commuters. The brisk fall air had brought a chill that seeped through her worn jacket, but she had learned to ignore the cold. She was used to it by now. As she settled in on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Madison Street, Sarah noticed Victoria slipping into the back of the Carlton Cafe. Victoria was carrying something small in her hand, a vial, and her expression was one that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. There was something unnerving about the way she carried herself. The coldness in her gaze was even more evident now as she hurried inside, disappearing from Sarah's sight. Sarah felt a strange knot form in her stomach. She couldn't explain why, but her gut told her something was wrong. She had seen Victoria come and go before, but this felt different. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something she wasn't meant to see. Just as Sarah's mind raced with confusion and fear, Richard's usual time for lunch arrived. 12:30 sharp, Richard emerged from the building, his tall frame casting a long shadow on the sunlit sidewalk. As he walked toward the cafe, his familiar presence momentarily calmed Sarah's racing thoughts. But today, as he passed by, something inside her snapped. Richard had always been kind to her, always acknowledged her as a person, but what she had just witnessed could not go unspoken. She had no proof, only a glimpse of a vial that looked suspiciously like poison. She had to warn him, even if it cost her everything. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah called out as she stood up, her voice shaking with uncertainty. A few passers-by turned to look, but Richard slowed his pace, recognition flickering across his face. He knew her as the young woman who often sat by the corner of the cafe. "Yes, young lady?" Richard asked, his voice warm, but with a slight edge of confusion. Sarah swallowed hard. This was it. "Don't eat the chicken salad today," she said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. "Your wife. I saw her go into the kitchen earlier. She had something, a vial. Please don't eat it." Richard's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to an uncomfortable mix of anger and embarrassment. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice lowering as he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're making some very serious accusations, young lady." "I'm not trying to scam you," Sarah insisted, her voice steadying as she took a step forward, despite her trembling legs. "I've seen things. I've watched your wife meet with someone else here, a younger man. And now, with the merger coming up, I'm worried. I think something's going to happen to you." Richard's face paled slightly at the mention of the merger. It wasn't public knowledge yet. It wasn't supposed to be. But somehow, this girl knew. "How do you know about the merger?" he asked, his tone softer now, but tinged with something deeper. Fear, perhaps. "I watch. I listen," Sarah said, her eyes locking with his. "People don't notice me. They talk freely." Richard took a moment to process this, and Sarah watched the gears turning in his mind. He knew she was no ordinary street kid. Her eyes weren't the vacant, defeated eyes of so many others. They were sharp, observant. They saw more than they let on. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Sarah continued, "but I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you, and I didn't say anything." Richard stood still, a long moment of silence stretching between them. Then, slowly, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "James," he said into the phone. "Yes, please come to the Carlton Cafe. Bring security and notify the precinct. Discreetly, please." He looked back at Sarah, his eyes still unreadable. "I'm not saying I believe you," Richard said finally, "but I've learned in business that it's better to be cautious than sorry." He paused. "Would you be willing to talk to the police?" Sarah nodded, despite the lump in her throat. She had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone believed her. As Richard walked into the cafe, flanked by his security team and plainclothes detectives, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The next few hours would decide everything. But for now, she would wait and watch. The thin thread of trust. The world inside the Carlton Cafe was a stark contrast to the harshness of the street. Inside, the clink of fine china and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air, creating an illusion of normalcy. Outside, on a cracked pavement, Sarah stood motionless, her eyes trained on the door, watching as Richard Thompson disappeared inside with his security team. Her breath came in short, nervous bursts, her body trembling slightly from the cold and the adrenaline of the moment. The weight of what she had done pressed on her chest, but she couldn't stop now. She had spoken the truth, and now it was up to Richard to decide what to do with it. Sarah had always been an observer. Her life on the streets had taught her to watch people closely, to listen when they thought no one was paying attention. She could read the body language of passers-by with frightening precision, noticing the way they shifted their eyes or the tension in their shoulders. It was a skill that had kept her safe in a world where people saw her as invisible, as someone who didn't matter. But today, she felt the sharp edge of being seen, the anxiety of revealing what she knew, of stepping out of the shadows and into a world that had always ignored her. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah tried to steady herself. She leaned against the brick wall of the cafe, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, as if holding herself together. Her thoughts raced. What if Richard didn't believe her? What if he turned her away, dismissed her as just another crazy street kid making wild accusations? The sound of footsteps approaching snapped her from her thoughts. She glanced up and saw Detective Martins, a sharp-eyed woman who had been talking to Richard's security team earlier, making her way toward her. In her hand, she carried a steaming paper cup of hot chocolate, a small but kind gesture that made Sarah's throat tighten. The detective had a no-nonsense demeanor, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood the weight of what Sarah had done. She wasn't just a street kid anymore, not in the eyes of this woman, not in the eyes of Richard Thompson. "Here," Detective Martinez said softly, handing Sarah the cup. "You look like you could use this." Sarah took the cup, her fingers trembling slightly. She was not used to kindness, not like this. Most people avoided her, passing by without a second thought. But here was someone who saw her, not as a problem to be ignored, but as a person who mattered. It was a feeling Sarah hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. Martinez sat down beside Sarah, her posture relaxed but attentive. She studied the young woman for a long moment before speaking. "I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure what to make of this whole situation. But one thing's clear, you didn't come here to cause trouble. You did what you thought was right. That takes courage." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Courage. She hadn't really thought of it that way. She had just acted on instinct, on the feeling in her gut that something terrible was about to happen. "I just didn't want to see someone get hurt," Sarah said quietly, looking down at the hot chocolate in her hands. The warmth of the cup was a stark contrast to the cold, empty feeling in her chest. Martinez nodded. "I can see that, and it's why I'm here now. You did the right thing. But I need to ask you, Sarah, why did you decide to speak up now? What made you trust Richard Thompson, of all people?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant, as she replayed the events of the day in her mind. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "I've watched him for months now. He's different from the others. He notices people. He doesn't ignore us. I've seen the way he looks at me. It's like he sees me, even though I'm invisible to everyone else." Martinez's eyes softened. "You've been invisible for a long time, haven't you?" Sarah nodded, her throat tightening again. "It's easier that way. People don't look at you if you don't make them. And when they don't see you, they don't hurt you." The detective was silent for a moment, her gaze steady and understanding. "I've seen that too, Sarah. It's why I do the job I do. To make sure people who are invisible get seen, that they're heard." Sarah looked up at the detective, her eyes searching. You really think I did the right thing? You think someone like me can make a difference?" "Yes," Martine said, her voice firm. "You've already made a difference. You've already saved a man's life." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a strange mix of disbelief and pride. Saved a life. Her. A homeless teenager who had been discarded by society. It felt surreal, almost impossible. Yet in this moment, she realized that what she had done mattered. It wasn't just a small act. It was a turning point. And now she had to follow through. At that moment, the doors to the cafe swung open, and Richard Thompson appeared again, flanked by his security team. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as his gaze swept across the street, searching for her. When his eyes met hers, there was a moment of silent acknowledgement. He wasn't angry anymore, not like before. Now there was something else in his expression, something like curiosity, maybe even gratitude. He approached her cautiously, his face unreadable. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice calm but edged with the tension of the situation. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you earlier. I should have trusted you. Thank you for coming forward." Sarah's heart raced. "I don't have any proof," she said, her voice trembling. "I just saw your wife go into the kitchen with that vial. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't look right." Richard nodded, his gaze narrowing. "The vial," he muttered under his breath. "You're right. We've had a few odd occurrences recently, but I didn't think it would go this far." Sarah watched as Richard seemed to fall into deep thought. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his shoulders slumped as if the weight of everything was finally catching up with him. For a moment, he looked vulnerable, like just another man, struggling to make sense of a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. And yet, Sarah knew he wasn't just any man. He was the CEO of a massive company, a man whose life was about to be turned upside down by the woman he trusted most. "You don't have to trust me," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady now. "But I can't stand by and let something happen to you. If you really want to know the truth, you should talk to the police." Richard studied her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He made a call, speaking in low tones. "James, I need you to bring down some security. We're going to need a few more eyes on this situation. And notify the police. I want everything checked, every detail." As Richard hung up the phone, he turned back to Sarah. "You were right to come to me. I'm not sure what to believe yet, but I'm going to find out. You've earned my trust, Miss Miller. I'll make sure this gets looked into properly. But I need you to be willing to work with us." Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't know if she was ready for what came next, but she had come too far to turn back. "I'll do whatever I can," she said firmly. "I just want to make sure nothing happens to you." Richard's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I won't forget this." As Richard walked back into the cafe, Sarah remained standing on the corner, her heart still racing. She had done what she thought was right. Now, the next step was in motion. What happened next would change everything. And in a way, it had already begun. The unraveling. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Sarah stood in the cold, the paper cup of hot chocolate now forgotten in her hands. She watched as Richard Thompson disappeared back into the Carlton Cafe with his security detail. The busy streets of New York continued to pulse around her, oblivious to the life-altering events that had just unfolded in their midst. For a moment, it felt as though the entire city had slowed down, holding its breath as the truth she had shared began to take root. In the distance, Sarah could see the flash of sirens, the arrival of police cars and unmarked vehicles. She felt a twinge of anxiety. What if she was wrong? What if this was all some terrible misunderstanding? She had no proof, only her gut instinct and the brief glimpse of the vial in Victoria's hand. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had been right. She had seen something that no one else had noticed. The way Victoria had looked when she entered the kitchen, the purposeful way she held that vial. It all pointed to something darker. But what if Richard's world was too big for someone like her, someone who had lived on the fringes of society, to truly understand? The sound of footsteps approaching drew her out of her thoughts. She turned to find Detective Martinez standing a few feet away, her posture professional but relaxed. She was holding a folder now, a small but significant stack of paperwork that seemed to carry the weight of something important. The detective had been moving in and out of the cafe for the past half hour, her sharp eyes catching every detail, and Sarah had noticed that the officers had started taking the situation more seriously. "How are you holding up?" Martinez asked, her voice soft but steady. Sarah shrugged. Her hands clutched tightly around her arms. She could feel the cold creeping under her worn jacket, but the chill in her bones seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper. I don't know. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was wrong. You weren't wrong, the detective replied firmly. Trust your instincts. People like you, people who are overlooked by the world, they see things differently. You noticed what no one else did, and now we've got a chance to stop something before it happens. Sarah stared at the ground, her mind swirling with a mix of disbelief and fear. What had she just gotten herself into? She had warned Richard Thompson. She had given him a chance, but what if it wasn't enough? What if she had missed something important, something that could prove her wrong? But the police were here now. The security team had been mobilized, and Richard was inside the cafe, speaking with the detectives and reviewing the situation. There was nothing left for Sarah to do but wait, and she hated waiting. The uncertainty gnawed at her, leaving her restless and anxious. But as much as she tried to quell the fear rising within her, there was something else beneath it, a flicker of hope. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah's attention was drawn back to the cafe as a group of uniformed officers began to file out, their faces stern as they carried small evidence bags. The air felt heavier now, like the weight of the truth was pressing in on everything around them. Sarah watched as Richard emerged from the cafe, his expression unreadable. He was flanked by the detectives and several of his security staff. When he spotted her, their eyes met again, and this time there was no anger, no suspicion, just a quiet, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He trusted her. That much was clear. As he approached, he gestured for her to step aside, out of the earshot of the growing crowd. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice low but steady, "thank you for everything. We've already taken a sample from the chicken salad, and it's being tested for poison right now. The police are conducting their investigation. I know you didn't have proof, but this could have cost me everything." His voice dropped, the weight of his words hanging between them. Sarah felt the sharp sting of reality as his words sank in. She had saved him. In that moment, she realized just how close she had come to losing everything herself. This wasn't just some casual observation. This was about life and death. About making the difference between a future stolen by betrayal and one that might still be redeemed. Richard Thompson, a man who had everything, wealth, power, influence, had been saved by a homeless teenager with no future, no prospects. But somehow, in the strangest twist of fate, Sarah had become the one to prevent his downfall. Richard looked at her for a long moment, as though trying to understand who this young woman was, how she had seen what no one else had. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved my life today," he said, his voice softening. "I don't know what's next, but I need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I need to get to the bottom of this." Sarah stood still, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She had never been in a position like this before. Never had she been asked to carry such a heavy weight. She wasn't a detective or a trained investigator. She was just a girl who had learned to survive by noticing things others didn't. But that's what had made the difference. It was her ability to pay attention, to be present in a world that often ignored people like her, that had made the difference today. I just want to make sure you are safe," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard seemed to understand something in her tone, something that hadn't been said but was now clear. "I'll make sure you're safe too," he promised, a sense of determination hardening his voice. "No one else can know about this, not yet. I'll handle it." Before Sarah could respond, a police officer emerged from the cafe holding a small plastic bag containing the remains of the chicken salad sandwich. He handed it over to one of the detectives, who immediately made their way to a waiting car, the evidence now in motion to be tested at a nearby lab. As the police began to clear the area and the crowd started to disperse, Sarah felt a strange emptiness wash over her. What was next? The city, which had felt so full of promise just hours ago, now seemed a little more distant, a little less forgiving. The chaos of the morning was over, but the questions still lingered. Inside the cafe, the security team had already begun combing through the footage from the cameras. It wasn't just about the poison anymore. There were deeper, darker layers to uncover. Victoria Thompson, Richard's wife, had been more than just an indifferent spouse. She was a woman with secrets, secrets that were now beginning to surface. The truth was unfolding rapidly, faster than Sarah could process. Victoria's visits to the cafe, her meetings with the mysterious younger man, and her behavior in the days leading up to the merger were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. As the police dug deeper into her financial records and personal life, they uncovered a series of suspicious transactions, money transfers to offshore accounts, and unusual patterns of withdrawal. And then there was the vial. The lab results came back quickly, confirming Sarah's worst fears. The chicken salad had been laced with a rare and deadly poison, one that would have been undetectable without specific testing. Sarah felt a rush of relief, mixed with guilt. Relief that she had been right, that she had saved Richard's life, but guilt because of the tragedy she had uncovered. Victoria Thompson wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a calculated murderer, a woman who had been orchestrating the deaths of her wealthy husbands for years. It wasn't just Richard she had planned to kill. It had been a pattern of manipulation and betrayal, one that had claimed multiple lives. Her web of lies had been carefully woven, and it had taken Sarah's watchful eyes to untangle it. But the more Sarah learned, the more she began to question everything she thought she knew. Her past, her father's collapse, her life on the streets. It all felt connected now. Betrayal, survival, redemption. These weren't just abstract concepts. They were the forces that shaped their lives. And in this moment, Sarah realized that she had a role to play in this new world, a role she had never imagined for herself. The next few days were a blur of police reports, security footage, and interviews. Sarah didn't have time to process everything. But one thing became clear. She had earned Richard's trust, and now, the ripple effects of her actions were beginning to unfold in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But as she sat on the corner again, watching the busy city pass her by, Sarah realized something important. This wasn't just a chance to change Richard's life. It was her chance to change her own. And perhaps for the first time, she wasn't invisible anymore. Shifting sands, the days following the discovery of Victoria's treachery, unfolded like a carefully written script, the kind that seemed too implausible to be real. Sarah, still reeling from the events of the past week, found herself caught in the whirlwind of attention that followed her warning to Richard Thompson. For years, she had been a ghost in the city, unseen, unnoticed, ignored. Now she had become the linchpin in a corporate scandal that threatened to unravel a life that, from the outside, appeared perfect. The first shift came in the form of Richard Thompson's gratitude. The CEO, once distant and aloof in his polished corporate world, had begun to treat her differently. He no longer saw her as just the homeless girl on the corner. He saw her as something more, something vital. He had always been aware of his surroundings, but Sarah's sharp eyes had shown him a world he had been blind to, one of hidden dangers and overlooked details. It was a kind of respect that Sarah wasn't sure how to handle. The second shift was in how the world now saw her, or rather, how they were starting to notice her. Sarah wasn't sure what to think of this new attention. She was no longer just the invisible teenager fighting for scraps on the cold sidewalks of New York City. She had saved Richard Thompson's life. She had exposed a murderous plot that had been years in the making, but none of it felt real. It was as though her entire existence had been flipped upside down in a matter of days. When Richard had first offered her a position in his company, she thought it was a joke. It felt too big, too out of reach. She was just a girl from the streets with no formal education, no professional experience. What could she possibly bring to a corporate giant like Thompson Industries? But when Richard had explained his offer, junior security analyst, full benefits, housing, a chance to finish her education. Sarah's world had shifted once more. She had never considered a future beyond survival, beyond getting through another day. But now the prospect of something different was on the table, and it terrified her. She had spent the next few days wrestling with this decision, with the weight of the offer pressing down on her. The promise of a better life, a real chance at success, was overwhelming. But it also meant leaving behind everything she had known. The streets, the survival instincts, the harshness of life on her own. It was all she had. And yet, there was something within her that wanted to take this step, something deep down that knew she couldn't keep living in the shadows forever. On a cold morning, just a few days after the events at the cafe, Sarah found herself walking into the sleek, glass-covered headquarters of Thompson Industries. The building itself was intimidating, towering, immaculate, and filled with people who moved with purpose and authority. As she passed through the lobby, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Everyone around her was dressed in business suits, their faces set in expressions of focus, as if they had a clear path laid before them. Sarah, on the other hand, felt like she was walking into a world that didn't belong to her, a world that she didn't know how to navigate. But then she remembered Richard's words. "You see things others don't. That's what makes you valuable." As she entered the security office, she was met by James, the head of security. James was tall, with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense attitude that was both intimidating and reassuring. He had been one of the first to meet her after Richard's offer. Initially, he had been skeptical, unsure of how a street kid like Sarah could fit into the highly structured world of corporate security. But after their first meeting, James had softened. She was sharp, quick to pick up on things others missed, and she had a resilience about her that he admired. "Sarah, right on time," James said, his voice a mixture of approval and curiosity. "We got a lot to go over today, but first, let's get you settled in." He handed her a set of keys, a corporate ID badge, and a folder with her name on it. Inside was a list of tasks she would need to familiarize herself with, as well as a training schedule for the next few weeks. "Thanks," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though her hands shook slightly as she took the folder. The weight of it all was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a job. It was her shot at a future. Over the next few hours, Sarah's head spun with new information. The security team, though initially skeptical of her presence, soon began to recognize her value. She had a way of looking at things that no one else could. She wasn't trained in corporate espionage or cybersecurity, but she had learned to read people, their movements, their intentions, their vulnerabilities. She could spot a threat from a mile away, not because she had formal training, but because she had spent her entire life on the lookout for danger. James noticed this. During their first simulation, where the security team ran drills on potential breaches, Sarah immediately pointed out a flaw in the rotation of the cleaning staff, an inconsistency in their schedule that could be exploited by a potential infiltrator. James was impressed. The team was too focused on digital threats, he realized, and had overlooked something as simple as physical access. "Not bad," James said after the drill was over. "You're more observant than most of the analysts we've had." Sarah smiled faintly. "I've had to be." The days began to blend together. She spent her mornings in training, learning the ins and outs of corporate security, and her afternoons working with the team, contributing her sharp eye to the ongoing investigation into the attempted poisoning. The security office became her refuge. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was finally starting to build something from the ground up. But even as Sarah settled into her new role, something in the back of her mind nagged at her. The investigation into Victoria's poisoning plot was still ongoing, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. She had seen the way Richard's world had been rocked by the betrayal of his wife, but Sarah had also seen something else, something that had been there all along but had been too easy to overlook. Victoria Thompson wasn't just a woman with a hidden agenda. She was part of a much larger network of deceit, And the more Sarah learned, the more she realized just how dangerous the situation was. Weeks passed, and Sarah began to piece together a troubling picture. Victoria's financial dealings were more than just suspicious. They were criminal. There were hidden transactions, offshore accounts, and strange movements of money that all pointed to a much larger conspiracy. But it wasn't just about Victoria. As Sarah dug deeper, she discovered that there were others, wealthy, powerful women who had been manipulating their husbands, orchestrating accidents, and pulling strings from behind the scenes. They had been using their marriages as a means to an end that involved power, money, and control. It was during a late-night meeting with James that Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. "There's something else," James said, his voice grim. "I've been going through the records. We've found connections between some of these women and a group of corporate investors. The same investors tied to our upcoming merger with the tech company." Sarah's stomach twisted. "You mean to tell me that Victoria wasn't working alone? That she had a whole network behind her?" James nodded. "Exactly. And we're just scratching the surface. There's a whole web of corruption here, and it leads right back to some of the most powerful people in the city." The gravity of the situation hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness, warning Richard about the poisoned sandwich, was now part of a much larger conspiracy. She was in the middle of something that could change everything. And in a strange way, she was the one who held the key to unlocking it all. The next day, as she sat at her desk in the security office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of something massive. She had always been good at seeing the connections others missed, but now she was beginning to see patterns that stretched beyond the streets she had once lived on. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a force that had the power to bring down a network of corruption that had been built over years. As she looked out of the window at the city below, Sarah thought about the path that had led her here. She had once believed that the only way to survive was to stay invisible, to remain unnoticed. But now she understood something far more important. That sometimes the best way to survive is to step into the light, to make yourself visible when it matters most. And as Sarah Miller looked out at the skyline of New York City, she realized that her second chance was just beginning. Into the fire. As Sarah continued her journey through the world of corporate security, she could feel the slow, steady transformation within herself. Every day, she learned something new, not just about the business world she had never imagined stepping into, but also about her own strength and resilience. The old Sarah, the one who had lived on the streets, barely surviving, had been a shadow. But the new Sarah, this one, was beginning to understand the power of standing tall in the light. However, as she settled into her new role, a sense of unease began to grow inside her. The deeper she dug into the mysterious connections surrounding Victoria Thompson and her network, the more she realized that the conspiracy was far larger than she had initially thought. The tech merger that Thompson Industries was planning was a linchpin in a much bigger game, one that involved powerful people, not just in the corporate world, but also within the highest circles of politics and law enforcement. The stakes had escalated beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. The more Sarah observed, the more she realized that her own involvement in this mess was a double-edged sword. On one hand, she was the one who had uncovered the truth, the one who had alerted Richard to the plot against him. But now she was entangled in a vast network of corruption that was determined to protect itself at any cost. Sarah had already put herself in danger once by warning Richard about the poisoning, but what she didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. The corporate halls that had once felt foreign to her were now places where Sarah was learning to navigate with a mix of caution and determination. But each day she walked those polished floors, she was reminded of just how far she had come, and just how much more there was at stake. Richard trusted her now, but trust didn't mean immunity. There were people out there who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, people who had too much to lose to allow a homeless street kid to bring their empire crashing down. It wasn't until one Thursday afternoon that everything shifted. The world she had stepped into was about to collapse, and Sarah was about to be thrown directly into the center of the storm. She had been reviewing surveillance footage from the company's facilities when her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Richard. "We need to talk. Meet me in my office, now." Her stomach tightened. Richard had been a constant presence in her life since the moment she'd warned him about Victoria's plans, but lately things had been more distant. The investigation into Victoria's network was unfolding rapidly, and the closer Sarah got to the truth, the more she realized that Richard, too, was in danger. Not just from his wife, but from the very people who had been backing her. People who didn't care about a CEO's life, but about their own financial empires. When Sarah arrived at Richard's office, she found him sitting behind his massive desk, his face drawn and weary. The usual confidence that radiated from him had been replaced with a quiet tension. He stood when she entered, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sarah," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I've been going over the latest developments. We're at a crossroads here." "Richard, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though her pulse was beginning to quicken. She had seen that look on his face before, the one that told her something was wrong. Richard leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled together. "We're getting too close to the truth. Too many people are watching us now. I've received threats, anonymous calls, strange emails, and I don't know who to trust anymore." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had known the dangers were coming, but hearing Richard admit it so directly brought everything into sharp focus. These weren't just abstract threats anymore. They were real, immediate, and deadly. "Who's behind it?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "That's the problem," Richard said, rubbing his temples. "I'm not sure, but I got a list of names. Some of them are board members, some are linked to the merger deal. There are people who have too much to lose if this thing goes public." For the first time, Sarah realized how truly perilous the situation was. It wasn't just Victoria Thompson they were up against anymore. It was an entire system of corruption that had been in place for years, a network so deeply entrenched that pulling one thread could bring the whole thing crashing down. Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked at Sarah, his gaze intense. "I need your help, Sarah. You've already shown that you have an uncanny ability to see what others miss. I'm afraid the only way we're going to survive this is if we expose the truth. But to do that, we need to be strategic. We need to be smarter than they are." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had no doubt that Richard was right. They were up against an invisible enemy, one that moved in the shadows, pulling strings behind closed doors. But this wasn't just about Richard's survival anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about taking down a system that had been feeding off the broken and the forgotten. People like her. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady now, as if she had finally found her place in this war. Richard hesitated for a moment, as though weighing the consequences of his next words. "I need you to keep an eye on the board members. We know that some of them are involved in this. But I also need you to work with the police. We can't do this alone. We need their help, and we need to get ahead of this before it's too late." Sarah's mind was already whirling with possibilities. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her role in this story was far from over. She wasn't just going to be a passive observer anymore. She was going to be the one to expose the corruption, the one to bring it all to light. But as she stood up to leave Richard's office, a thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. "Richard," she said, her voice suddenly urgent, "there's one more thing. We need to look into your own financial records. If the board members are involved, they might have used your company to funnel money. We could be looking at a much deeper conspiracy." Richard's face tightened. "I've thought about that. But if there's one thing I know, it's that the people who are behind this are ruthless. They won't stop at anything to cover their tracks." "I know," Sarah said quietly, "but we can't afford to wait any longer. If we don't move now, we're going to lose everything." Richard looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching. Then, with a slow nod, he made his decision. All right, let's do it. The next few days became a blur of intense investigation. Late nights spent combing through records, security footage, and phone calls. Sarah worked alongside James, who had become one of her closest allies, and with the help of Detective Martinez, they began to unravel the web of corruption that had been carefully spun over the years. Every day, the stakes grew higher, and Sarah felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She wasn't just risking her own future now. She was risking everything she had fought for. One evening, as Sarah reviewed a batch of encrypted emails, something caught her eye. A pattern. A link between some of the board members and a shadowy figure involved in illegal offshore investments. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. She called Richard immediately. "I found something. You need to see this." He was in his office within minutes, his face tense as he scanned the screen. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. "I tracked down a few leads," Sarah said, her eyes locked on the screen. "We have a connection between your board members and the offshore accounts linked to Victoria's network. If we can trace the money, we'll have everything we need." Richard's expression shifted from concern to determination. "This could take them down. But we need to act fast. If they find out we're onto them, they'll destroy the evidence." Sarah nodded. "I'm ready." Together, they prepared to confront the people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. It was a dangerous game, one where trust could turn into betrayal in the blink of an eye. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She had seen the darkness that lived within the system, and now she was ready to bring it into the light. The pieces were falling into place, and the storm was about to hit. The tipping point. The walls of Thompson Industries seemed to close in on Sarah as she worked alongside Richard and the security team to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. Every lead they followed, every encrypted message they uncovered, added another layer to the conspiracy they had been hunting. It was as though they were pulling at a single thread, only to find that it unraveled into a vast, tangled web that reached deeper and wider than any of them could have imagined. For days, Sarah barely left the security office, her focus sharpened by the knowledge that they were on the verge of something monumental. She had always known the streets, had always known how to watch people and see what others didn't. But now, as she navigated the labyrinth of corporate deceit and betrayal, she realized how much she had changed. She wasn't just the homeless girl anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting to uncover the truth and stop a powerful network from destroying everything Richard had worked for. The breakthrough came when Sarah traced a series of wire transfers that had initially seemed unrelated. Hidden within the digital footprints were payments that linked several board members to a shell company based in a remote part of the world. It was a classic move, money laundered through an untraceable network, meant to mask illicit deals that could destabilize Thompson Industries and jeopardize Richard's position in the upcoming merger. "Sarah, you're a step ahead of us again," James said, his voice filled with reluctant admiration as he stood beside her in the security office, reviewing the data on the screen. "This is the smoking gun we've been looking for." She nodded but didn't feel the satisfaction of victory. The more they uncovered, the more she realized the sheer scale of the operation they were up against. The tech merger that Richard had been so focused on was just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper they dug, the more Sarah saw that this wasn't just corporate greed. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate the entire financial system. Powerful individuals from all sectors, politics, law, banking, were involved, all with their own interests at stake. Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that even with all this evidence, they were still only scratching the surface. The people behind the conspiracy weren't going to go down without a fight. She knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. It wasn't long before Richard received his first direct threat. The security team had intercepted a phone call intended for him, its tone cold and threatening. The voice on the other end was muffled, but the message was unmistakable. "Stop what you're doing. or your company, your life. It all ends. Richard had listened to the message with a stoic expression, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just the threat to his life. It was the realization that they were all now in danger. These were people who didn't hesitate to eliminate obstacles. And Sarah knew, deep in her gut, that she was no longer just working alongside Richard to uncover the truth. She was now a target. "Sarah," Richard said later, when they were alone in his office, "this is getting worse. I can't let them hurt anyone else. You've already put yourself at risk by helping me. But now, we need to take this further. We have the evidence. We need to go to the authorities." Sarah stood by the window, her eyes scanning the streets below. She was still adjusting to the luxury of Richard's office, to the polished, clean environment that felt so far removed from the gritty corners of the city where she had once lived. But the view from the window didn't provide the comfort it once might have. The city felt oppressive now, the people moving in their daily rush completely unaware of the storm brewing just below the surface. "I know we have to go to the authorities," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But the police, we can't trust them all. We've already seen how deep this runs. If we expose what we know, there's no telling how far they'll go to cover their tracks." Richard looked at her with a mix of concern and admiration. "You're right. That's why we need to be careful. We can't just trust anyone, but we need to find a way to make sure the right people hear our story. Otherwise, everything we've worked for, everything you've risked, will be for nothing." Sarah didn't know what the right move was anymore. She had grown used to surviving in a world where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But this was different. The stakes were too high. People's lives were at risk. Richard's life. Her life. They had no choice but to push forward, no matter the consequences. The decision was made to go public. They couldn't wait for the authorities to act. It was clear that they were compromised. So Richard and Sarah agreed to take their evidence straight to the media. It was a dangerous move, one that could backfire spectacularly. But they had no choice. The world needed to know what was happening, and the only way to stop the conspirators was to expose them to the light. James helped coordinate the release of the information to a trusted investigative journalist. They knew it was risky, but it was the only way to ensure that the truth would reach the public, without being buried or erased before it had a chance to be heard. The night before the story was set to break, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her new apartment, staring out at the city lights that stretched endlessly before her. She was no longer a part of that world of shadows. The moment she had stepped into this battle, she had crossed a threshold. There was no going back now. But despite the fear gnawing at her insides, there was something else, something powerful. She had fought for survival for so long, fought to stay invisible, to stay out of the way. But now she was fighting for something bigger. She was fighting to take down a system that had broken people like her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was making sure the next generation didn't have to. The next morning, as Richard and Sarah sat in his office, watching the first reports come in, the phone rang. It was a calm, steady voice on the other end. "We've been expecting you," the voice said. "It's time we had a conversation." It was the start of something bigger, something that would take Sarah down a path she hadn't anticipated. She had only just begun to understand how deep the corruption went. The forces aligned against them were formidable. And now Sarah realized there was no more pretending. The fight was no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about staying alive long enough to make sure the truth would be heard. As the hours passed and the media buzzed with the breaking news, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was teetering on the brink. And she was about to be thrust into the heart of a battle that would not only change her life forever, but the lives of countless others who had been trapped in a system of corruption and deceit for far too long. The tipping point had come. There was no turning back. And as the storm began to gather around them, Sarah stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. She had been invisible for far too long. Now she would make sure no one could look away.